The moment my new boss's son didn't look up from his phone when I walked into the conference room, I knew exactly how this meeting was going to end. I'd been in that building for 29 years. I knew which elevator stuck between floors 2 and 3. I knew the janitor's name, Hector, and that he took his coffee with 4 sugars and kept a photo of his granddaughter taped inside his cart. I knew the smell of the place in January when the heating system kicked on too hard, that faint burn dust smell that meant winter had officially arrived. 29 years, and the kid sitting at the head of the table, scrolling through something on his phone while I stood in the doorway, hadn't been alive for half of them. His name was Zachary Alderman, the new CEO's son. His father, Edward Alderman, had bought Meridian Systems 8 months ago through a private equity acquisition. One of those deals that gets announced in a press release full of words like synergy and operational excellence and exciting new chapter. I'd survived 3 ownership changes in my career. I told myself this one would be no different. I was the director of infrastructure engineering. What that meant, practically, was that I had designed, built, and maintained the proprietary network routing system that Meridian's entire logistics operation ran on. Every shipment tracked, every warehouse coordinated, every delivery optimized. It all moved through a system I had architected from scratch starting in 2009, back when the company had 12 employees and operated out of a converted auto parts store in Columbus, Ohio. We had 400 employees now, 31 distribution centers across the Midwest and Southeast, a government contract with the Department of Veterans Affairs that brought in $40 million a year. And it all ran on my system, not because the company hadn't tried to replace it. They had. Twice. Both times the outside vendors they brought in couldn't replicate what I'd built. Both times they came back to me. Zach finally looked up from his phone when I sat down. "So," he said. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important. "I've been reviewing the infrastructure costs." I nodded. I'd reviewed them too. I knew every line. "We're moving to a cloud-native architecture," he said. "Full migration. We've already engaged a vendor." I waited. I'd heard this before. The transition timeline is 90 days. I sat with that for a moment. 90 days to migrate a system that handles routing logic for 31 facilities and a federal contract. The vendor has done this before. Not with our system, they haven't. The VA contract alone has compliance requirements that took us 14 months to build into the current architecture. He looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided to throw away. That's what the transition period is for. Zach. I leaned forward slightly. I'm not trying to protect my own position here. I'm telling you that 90 days is not enough time to safely migrate this without service disruption. If we lose even 6 hours of routing continuity on the VA contract, we trigger a penalty clause. That's a $2 million fine and a 60-day performance review that could cost us the renewal. He set his phone face down on the table. That was when I knew I'd miscalculated. Not about the system, but about the conversation. I'd made the mistake of being right in front of someone who hadn't asked for my opinion. "I appreciate the input," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "But we've made the decision. We'll need your cooperation during the transition. Your role will shift to," he glanced at a paper in front of him, "advisory capacity. Reduced scope." Reduced scope. That's what they call it when they've already hired your replacement, but the paperwork isn't finished yet. I drove home that evening on autopilot. My wife asked me how the meeting went. I told her fine. I'm not sure why I said that. She knew. She's known me for 31 years, longer than I'd worked at Meridian, and she has a way of reading the set of my shoulders that I've never been able to hide from. She didn't push. She just made dinner and let me sit with it. 3 weeks later, HR called me in and walked me through a separation agreement, effective immediately. 30 years of service. The severance package was decent. 6 months of salary, continuation of benefits. The HR director, a woman I'd worked with for 12 years, kept her eyes on the paperwork the whole time. She didn't look at me once. I signed where they told me to sign. I shook the hands they offered me. I drove out of the parking lot for the last time on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a box containing a coffee mug, a desk plant, and a framed photo of my daughter at her college graduation. Traffic was bad on 270. It took me 40 minutes to get home when it usually takes 25. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I didn't do what I'd seen other people do. The LinkedIn farewell post, the carefully worded announcement about exciting new opportunities. I just went home, put the box in the garage, and sat in the kitchen for a while watching the light change on the backyard. My daughter called that evening. She's sharp, she gets that from her mother, and she'd already heard something through a former colleague of mine who knew her. She was furious in the way that only people who love you can be furious on your behalf. Dad, 29 years, they can't just... They can, I said, and they did. What are you going to do? I told her I wasn't sure yet. That was true. But there was something sitting in the back of my mind, something I hadn't let myself look at directly yet. A small, quiet thing that had been there since the day I first started at Meridian, a long time ago, when the original founders had asked me to build something no one else had built before. I needed to find a specific document. The next morning, I went to my home office, the actual office, not the basement where I'd been working remotely. The real one, with the filing cabinet I'd moved 3 times across 3 houses. I knew approximately where the document was. But approximately is not the same as knowing. I found it in the 3rd drawer, behind a folder of old tax returns. A manila envelope, legal size, slightly yellowed. I'd sealed it myself back in 2009 and never had reason to open it since. On the front, in my own handwriting, Meridian Routing Architecture. Original development records. Personal copy. I sat down with it. In 2009, when the original CEO, a man named Harlow, who'd built the company himself from nothing and whom I respected more than almost anyone I'd ever worked for, had brought me on, he'd asked me to build a proprietary routing system. There was no budget for outside contractors. It was going to be me, a whiteboard, and whatever I could pull from 15 years of network engineering experience. We'd worked out a contract together. Harlow had a lawyer. I had a friend from college who'd gone into IP law and owed me a favor from a camping trip in 2001, where I'd pulled him out of a river. His name was Peter, and he was the best favor I ever collected on. Peter had read through the employment agreement Harlow's lawyer drafted. He called me afterward and said, "There's something you need to understand about how this is written. The agreement assigned the routing system IP to Meridian upon development completion. Standard stuff. But Peter had caught a clause, or rather, the absence of one. The assignment language was tied to continued employment. Specifically, it included a provision that if my employment was terminated without cause or in breach of good faith obligations, the IP assignment would revert to me. I'd asked Peter if that was unusual. "It's not common," he said. "But Harlow's lawyer drafted this fast and I think they were just trying to get you in the door. The clause is sloppy. It's actually protective of you." I'd asked if I should flag it. "You could," Peter said, "or you could just know it's there." I'd just known it was there. For 16 years. When I opened the envelope that morning in my home office, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The original signed employment agreement. Peter's handwritten notes from our phone call, which I'd asked him to send me because I had a feeling I'd want them someday. A copy of the initial architectural design document for the routing system, stamped with a date and notarized. Peter's idea, not mine. I read through the termination clause 3 times. Then I called Peter. He picked up on the second ring. We hadn't talked in about 8 months. He still had the same voice, low and unhurried, the voice of someone who's spent decades learning that the most important thing you can do in a difficult situation is not panic. I explained what had happened. I explained the termination. I explained that Meridian's new ownership had given me a separation agreement citing organizational restructuring. Not cause, not performance, not misconduct. Peter was quiet for a moment. "Send me the separation agreement and the original contract," he said. I scanned and emailed them within the hour. He called back that afternoon. "Okay," he said, "here's where we are." He walked me through it carefully. The original contract's IP reversion clause used specific language, termination without cause, or, and this was the part I hadn't fully remembered, termination resulting from a material organizational change not initiated by or consented to by the developer. The private equity acquisition and subsequent restructuring qualified. Possibly. They would depend on how Meridian's lawyers argued it. But the clause was there. It was clear, and it was enforceable. "The system you built," Peter said, "is it still the core operational system?" "Yes." "And they're planning to replace it?" They've contracted a vendor. 90-day migration timeline. Peter made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. So they fired the person who owns the reversion rights to the system they're currently dependent on, while they're in the middle of trying to replace it. That appears to be correct. Okay, he said. Here's what I need you to do. Nothing. Don't contact Meridian. Don't contact the new CEO or his son. Don't talk to former colleagues about this. Just let me make some calls and prepare a filing. Can you give me 2 weeks? 2 weeks. I could do that. My wife noticed the change in me that evening, not visible excitement. I was careful about that, because I've lived long enough to know that counting on something before it's real is how you break your own heart. But something had shifted. She asked me if I was okay. I think so, I said. You found something. I looked at her. I found something. She nodded, the way she nods when she understands more than she's saying, and went back to her book. The 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went on walks. I reorganized the garage. I finally fixed the gutter on the north side of the house that had been pulling away from the fascia since October. I watched a lot of baseball. I did not call Meridian. I did not email Zach. I did not do anything except wait and trust Peter. On a Wednesday morning, exactly 13 days after our phone call, Peter sent me an email with 2 attachments and 3 words in the subject line, ready to send. The first attachment was a formal legal notice to Meridian Systems LLC, its parent company, Alderman Capital Partners, and its registered legal representatives. The notice cited the specific clause in my original employment contract, documented the circumstances of my termination, and formally asserted that the IP assignment for the Meridian routing architecture had legally reverted to me upon my termination. The second attachment was a temporary injunction application to the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, seeking to halt any migration, modification, or transfer of the routing system pending resolution of the IP ownership dispute. I read through both documents twice. Then I wrote back to Peter, send it. He sent it on a Thursday. By Friday morning, my phone had started ringing. I didn't answer. I watched the calls come in. Numbers I recognized from Meridian, numbers I didn't recognize that I assumed were attorneys, one number that turned out to be Zach's direct line. I let them all go to voicemail. I made coffee. I sat on the back porch and watched a pair of cardinals argue over the bird feeder my wife had put up in February. The voicemails were something. Zach's was the most interesting. He had dropped most of the confidence. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard in our one conversation. A kind of tight, controlled worry that people get when they've realized something has gone very wrong, and they don't yet know how wrong. Meridian's general counsel called twice. The second time, she left a message asking me to please reach out at my earliest convenience to discuss a potential resolution to a contractual misunderstanding. That phrase, contractual misunderstanding, told me everything I needed to know about how their lawyers had read the clause. I forwarded all the voicemails to Peter. He called me Sunday evening. They want to talk, he said. I know. I'd like to set up a meeting this week. I think we should go in with a specific proposal rather than waiting for them to offer something. Peter's proposal was this. Rather than pursuing full reversion, which would have been legally complex and time-consuming, even with the clause, we would offer Meridian a licensing agreement. They could continue using the routing system, but they would pay for it. A structured licensing fee tied to their annual revenue from operations dependent on the system. Based on Meridian's current revenue, Peter's initial calculation came out to approximately $2.4 million per year. I asked him if that was realistic. Given what the system does for them, he said, and given that their alternative is a 90-day migration that their own engineering team has told them carries significant risk, yes, I think it's realistic. I asked how he knew their engineering team had concerns about the migration. He paused. I have a contact. I didn't ask further. The meeting was held on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Peter had sent the notice. Downtown Columbus at a conference room in a law firm that wasn't mine and wasn't Meridian's, neutral ground. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my daughter's law school graduation. My wife had ironed it the night before without me asking. Edward Alderman was there. Zach's father. I'd only seen him once before, at an all-hands meeting shortly after the acquisition. He was a precise-looking man in his late 60s, the kind who communicates primarily through stillness. He watched the entire proceeding without speaking for the first 40 minutes. Meridian's legal team had 3 attorneys. Peter came alone. It took 4 hours. Peter was methodical and patient and exactly the kind of person you want in a room when the other side has more lawyers than you do. He walked through the contract language, the circumstances of my termination, the documentation we had. When Meridian's lead attorney tried to argue that the material organizational change clause didn't apply because the termination had been framed as restructuring rather than acquisition-driven, Peter pulled out a copy of the press release Alderman Capital had issued when they bought Meridian. He read 3 specific sentences from it aloud. Then he set it down and didn't say anything else. It was the quietest moment in the room. Edward Alderman spoke for the first time around the 3-hour mark. He looked at me directly, which none of the lawyers had done. "You built the system," he said. "Yes." "How long did it take?" "The initial build was about 14 months. Continuous development since then." He nodded slowly. "And you believe the migration they're planning will fail?" "I believe it will fail within 90 days, I said. "The VA contract compliance alone requires." "I've been briefed," he said. He looked at his attorneys, then back at me. "What do you want?" It was the right question. The only question, really. I told him what Peter and I had discussed. The licensing structure, the fee, the technical support provisions, because if they were going to keep running my system, I wanted to make sure it was maintained correctly. And one more thing, something Peter hadn't known I was going to ask for, because I'd only decided the night before. I asked that any public documentation of the settlement acknowledge that the routing architecture had been designed and developed by me. Not a press release, nothing flashy, just the record. Internal documentation that could be cited in future contracts and audits. Edward Alderman looked at me for a long moment. "That's it," he said. "That's it." He turned to his attorneys. Something passed between them that I didn't fully read. Then he turned back. "We'll need to finalize the fee structure," he said, "but I don't think we have a fundamental disagreement here." Zach wasn't at the meeting. I noticed that. I don't know if it meant anything. Maybe his father had decided this was above his pay grade. Maybe Zach had requested not to be there. Either way, the seat where he might have sat was empty. The final agreement took another 6 weeks to negotiate and execute. The licensing fee landed at $1.8 million per year, lower than Peter's opening ask, higher than Meridian's first counter. There were provisions for annual adjustment tied to the consumer price index. There were technical maintenance clauses that gave me inspection rights twice a year. And there was the documentation provision, exactly as I'd asked for. Peter called me the morning the final signatures were in. "It's done," he said. I thanked him. He said he'd sent his invoice. I told him whatever it wasn't enough. He laughed. The same laugh from 24 years ago on a riverbank in Tennessee when I'd hauled him out of the current by his collar. Some things don't change. My daughter cried when I told her. Happy crying, the kind that comes out sideways because it was supposed to be anger. My wife opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving since our anniversary 2 years ago and said we probably should have opened it sooner, and I agreed with her, the way I always eventually agree with her about these things. I wasn't going back to Meridian. That chapter was done, and I didn't want to reopen it. But I wasn't starting over from nothing either. The licensing income gave me time and flexibility that I hadn't had in 3 decades of employment. Time to consult on my own terms. Time to think about what I wanted to build next, if I wanted to build anything. I kept the original employment contract in the same manila envelope. I moved it from the filing cabinet to the fireproof safe I'd bought the previous fall. Something I probably should have done years earlier. It sits there now next to our passports and my wife's grandmother's jewelry and the deed to the house. A few months after the settlement, I ran into Hector in the parking lot of a hardware store on the east side. He'd retired from Meridian not long after I left. 32 years, he told me, shaking his head like he still couldn't quite believe the number. His granddaughter was in middle school now. He showed me a photo on his phone. "You hear they brought in a whole new system?" he said. I heard something about that. Went down for 11 hours in October. Missed 47 VA shipments. He put his phone back in his pocket. Lot of scrambling. I nodded. There usually is. We shook hands in the parking lot of a hardware store on a cold November afternoon and went our separate ways. I drove home with a bag of weather stripping in the back seat. The gutter on the north side had started pulling again. Some things you just have to keep fixing. That's not a defeat. That's just how it goes when you've built something worth maintaining. I keep thinking about that parking lot conversation with Hector. 32 years he gave that place. Same as me, almost. And what struck me wasn't the bitterness. There wasn't much of it, honestly. It was how matter-of-fact he was about it, like a man who'd made peace with something that didn't deserve the energy of being fought. I'm not sure I fully made that peace yet, but I'm closer than I was. What I've learned, not from this situation alone, but from 29 years of watching how organizations actually work versus how they say they work, is that the people who last are almost never the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who do the thing nobody else wanted to do it correctly, and then document it. They keep their name on their work, not out of ego, out of honesty. There's a difference, and it matters more than most people realize, until the moment it suddenly matters enormously. Zach walked into that conference room and saw a problem to be eliminated. What he didn't see, what his whole approach to the world didn't allow him to see, was that the problem had 30 years of institutional knowledge behind it and a contract clause he'd never bothered to read. That's not bad luck. That's what happens when confidence outruns competence for long enough. The world has a way of correcting that imbalance. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. I've watched it happen more times than I can count. Peter used to say that the most powerful thing a person can bring to any negotiation is patience. Not aggression, not cleverness, just the willingness to wait and let the situation speak for itself. I didn't understand what he meant when we were 26 years old on a camping trip in Tennessee. I understand it now. The 2 weeks I spent waiting after he sent that notice, fixing the gutter, watching baseball, not calling anyone. Those were 2 of the hardest weeks I'd had in years, and they were the right call. Every day I didn't act out of emotion was a day I stayed in the stronger position. I think about what my daughter said when I told her the settlement was finalized. She didn't say you won. She said you stayed yourself through the whole thing. That hit different than I expected, because the temptation, and it was real, I won't pretend otherwise, was to be angry in a way that would have made me smaller, to make it personal, to make noise, to want Zach to know exactly how wrong he'd been. I didn't do any of that, not because I'm a particularly patient person by nature, but because I understood, somewhere in the back of my mind, that the work was the argument. The documentation was the argument. Peter's letter was the argument. You build something real, you protect it properly, and you do the unglamorous work of maintaining it year after year. That's the whole game. Not the title, not the office, not being seen in the right meetings. The actual thing you built. That's what stays. I'm still not sure what I'm building next. I have time now that I didn't have before. That's not nothing. In fact, at 57 years old, with a fireproof safe that finally has the right things in it, I'd say it might be the most valuable thing I own.